Hey guys, it's Crystal from livingwithgastroparesis.com and it's FAQ Friday. So today I want to talk about diagnosing gastroparesis. This is something that keeps coming up on my Facebook page. I get a lot of emails about it. People are confused about the way in which gastroparesis can be diagnosed, the best way to diagnose it, and what the test results mean. And I think in large part that's because there really is no standardized diagnostic test for gastroparesis. I don't understand why, it makes no sense to me, but the gastric emptying study is done differently from medical center to medical center. Sometimes the procedures are drastically different and the protocols are drastically different. Some people have a 1-hour study, some people have a 2-hour study, some people have a 4-hour study. Sometimes you eat oatmeal, sometimes you eat eggs, sometimes you eat chicken soup. I've heard of people who lie down the entire test as opposed to getting up and leaving the room between scans. There really is no standardized procedure, and therefore the results can be all over the map. Now, the gold standard for diagnosing gastroparesis, based on the various studies that they've done, is a 4-hour gastric emptying scan, done usually with eggs and toast as a test meal, and where the participant gets up between scans, so you're not lying flat the entire time. This test, they've found, is the most accurate way at this point to diagnose gastroparesis. There was a study where they looked at the diagnosis between a 2-hour cutoff point and a 4-hour cutoff point, and they actually found that up to 40% of cases could be missed if you went just based on the 2-hour results. So people can have normal gastric emptying or within normal limits at 2 hours and have delayed gastric emptying at 4 hours. Now, they did also find that some people have delayed gastric emptying at 2 hours and it normalizes by 4 hours, though that was less common. So really, 4 hours is the length of the test that seems to be the most accurate. If you have gastroparesis-like symptoms and you had a normal 2-hour emptying study, it might be worth asking for a 4-hour study to better evaluate what's actually going on. So that's the first thing that you need to know. The gold standard for diagnosing gastroparesis is a 4-hour gastric emptying scan, usually done with the eggs and toast, where you get up between scans. Now, people often ask, what do the test results mean? You know, what's a normal gastric emptying time? And so typically, if there is more than 10% of the test meal remaining after 4 hours, that's considered delayed gastric emptying. The 2-hour cutoff point, I believe, is more than 60% of the meal remaining at 2 hours. But like we just said, the most accurate way to diagnose it is the 4-hour test. So if there's more than 10% of that test meal remaining at 4 hours, that would be considered delayed gastric emptying. Now, once again, I've talked about this before, but just to reiterate, the diagnosis of gastroparesis then doesn't necessarily indicate the severity of the delay. So if you have, 85% of the meal emptied at 4 hours, that's diagnosed as gastroparesis. If you have 15% of the meal emptied at 4 hours, that's also diagnosed as gastroparesis, okay? So the severity of the delay within the diagnosis of gastroparesis can vary dramatically, and that's why you often see such different experiences between people with gastroparesis. Likewise, now I said if you have gastroparesis symptoms and you had a normal 2-hour emptying study, you might want to ask for a 4-hour study. If you have gastroparesis-like symptoms and a normal 4-hour study, that's sometimes diagnosed as functional dyspepsia. And so a lot of people will ask, what's the difference between gastroparesis and functional dyspepsia? Some people will actually get both diagnoses, so they'll go to one doctor and they'll say it's functional dyspepsia, and they'll go to another doctor and say it's gastroparesis. They seem to fall kind of along the same spectrum. The symptoms are very, very similar: early satiety, nausea, bloating, pain. And so really the difference seems to be the actual dysmotility, so the delay in gastric emptying. Functional dyspepsia is basically gastroparesis-like symptoms in the absence of the marked delay in gastric emptying. So if you have a normal gastric emptying scan and you still have all of these symptoms, you may be diagnosed with functional dyspepsia. Now, in terms of the dietary modifications and the lifestyle practices for functional dyspepsia and gastroparesis, they're very similar and they're managed much the same way. But it's important to understand the difference between those two diagnoses, and also to understand that, just because there's not necessarily that demonstrated delay, it doesn't make functional dyspepsia any less, real than gastroparesis. And so I think that's something that's important to understand, because sometimes gastric emptying can normalize over time, but your symptoms remain. And so then you may have originally been diagnosed as gastroparesis, and then your emptying studies come back normal, and you may hear functional dyspepsia. And I think it's important to understand that that doesn't discount the symptoms that you're having. So I hope that brings a little bit of clarity to this topic. I know it's something that for a lot of people is confusing, can be frustrating, but it's important to keep in mind, again, the gold standard for diagnosing GP, the 4-hour gastric emptying study. Remember that these functional motility disorders, you can't see them, okay? So the doctor can't look inside and see damage like they might from gastritis or an ulcer, okay? There's nothing visibly abnormal. There's no kind of structural issue. There's nothing that they can see. It's the way that the system functions. And so that's why it's so difficult to diagnose, but the 4-hour gastric emptying scan does seem to be the most accurate tool for diagnosis. So I hope that was helpful. If you liked it, click the like button, share it, come on over to my Facebook page, let's talk about it, and make sure on my mailing list. I'm going to be doing some really fun things when my new book is released very soon, with giveaways and stuff like that, and it's going to all be done through the mailing list. So make sure you're on it. You can go to bit.ly/GP signup, and I will see you next week for another FAQ Friday.